And I'm very excited to welcome you to the fourth webinar of our Brown at 70 series, Black Education and the Pursuit of Democracy. Our past webinars, which were recorded, can be viewed on the LPI website with accompanying PowerPoint slides and resources. And I want to acknowledge our hosts and our co-hosts. This series has been hosted by LPI and by the Spencer Foundation. It's been co-sponsored by the California Association of African American Superintendents and Administrators and the National Coalition on Education Equity. And I want to call out special thanks to Dwight Bonds and Diana Daniels, who are leading these organizations with vision and courage in this time. This is the product of a set of studies we jointly undertook, which are posted individually on both LPI's and Spencer's websites and have resulted in this book, Equity in Education Since Brown v. Board, which was just published. And there's the QR code if you want to find it. This webinar reflects on the meaning of Brown for Black education, both in 1954 and the years following, and in the present and in the years ahead. The Brown decision both had positive and negative effects on Black education, as it was met first with massive resistance that profoundly affected public education, as well as the students who were caught in the crossfire. And then it was addressed in ways that created both opportunities and trauma for Black students and educators. As a momentous piece of public policy, Brown has also meant more than desegregation of schools for Black students. It has had broad and sweeping effects for civil rights across our society and for our conception of public education's mission and purposes. And we have a brilliant panel to take up these issues. And I'm going to start us off with President Naila Nasir, who is the president of the Spencer Foundation, which funds educational research that has, under her leadership, had increasing impact on policy and practice. She is past president of the American Education Research Association. She was previously on the faculty at UC Berkeley, where she also served as vice chancellor for equity and inclusion, and at Stanford University, where she brilliantly co-taught a course on principles of learning to pre-service teachers, among many other things, and in which setting I learned a lot from her as a co-instructor. She does a wide variety of research on out of the learning sciences, focusing on how culture, identity, and race influence students' learning, achievement, and educational trajectories. She's the lead editor on a seminal handbook on the cultural foundations of learning, and will start us off today.
Great, thank you, Linda, for that really generous introduction. So I just want to start by thanking you, Linda, for the partnership around these webinars. It's been, we planned them a year or so ago, and who would have thought we'd be in this moment where it just feels so important to be coming together, to be reflecting on both looking back and looking forward and thinking about where we are as a field. So just really grateful for that opportunity to continue to come back to our values, to continue to remember we can talk about equity in education, and to continue to think about the role of schools in stewarding a multicultural democracy. It's also really mattered to me personally to be able to have the space to think in a forward-leaning way in a very reactionary time, because I think one of the tricks, and we'll get into this, but one of the tricks of a moment like this is to get tricked into just reacting rather than to be thinking productively about what we need to build moving forward. So Black education and the pursuit of democracy, so much to say about Black education and how we pursue democracy at this moment in a time. By all accounts, our democracy is at risk in our country right now. Black education too, some might say. So I welcome this conversation and opportunity to think about these two things in relation to one another and to consider directions forward. Interestingly, today's webinar also falls during the Muslim holy month of Ramadan. And Ramadan is when, of course, Muslims fast, but Ramadan is not about hunger, it's about reflection. And it's a pause, right, that allows you to get grounded in your values and in your purpose. It is about remembering what is most important and pulling back to remember why we're here and what our lives are about. So for me, that provides kind of a lovely context and an intention for the time we have together with my esteemed co-panelists who will be introduced in a moment. Democracy and Black education are big topics. They are broad and lofty in a way that invites us to step back and dream bigger. So in that spirit, I wanted to frame just a few thoughts or tensions as we head into the conversation today. And good numbered list. I got 5 things. One, a core question many of us should be asking right now isn't about how we should react right now. We need to ask that question, answer it, and do some things. But we should also be asking what we want to build for the future. And the danger, again, is that we get so caught up in this moment and all of the swirling and the chaos that we lose track of the important future building work that any crisis actually calls us into doing. Second, as Carol's chapter points out, Black education is both the history of building our own independent institutions and a history of advocating for formal systems to be accessible and to serve all students, obviously, including Black students. Since this has not been the history of such systems, what might each of these strategies look like today? What are the institutions we need to build, and what are the ways we need to shift the formal structures? Meaning, what are the targeted and nurturing community institutions we need right now to nurture Black students, to develop potential? And what are the ways we need to adapt, alter, and rebuild public institutions to meet the needs of Black communities and other communities? We have witnessed efforts in recent years, recent decades, such as leaning into market-based forces with charter schools and other moves to privatization. That hasn't worked well for the system as a whole or for the over 80% of young people in non-charter public schools. We have witnessed the accountability era, which seems to be coming to an end in most places at least. And we have, that has been kind of a narrowing of the focus to a focus on test taking. Kent's chapter makes this point well. And so we need to be thinking on multiple levels at once about the kinds of systems we need to build, steward, and alter. 3, as we do that, our long-term goal has to be an entire society where we all belong. And I'm drawing on John Powell's new book here, Othering and Belonging, which for me leads to the question, what might it look like to build an education where everyone belongs? What would be the building blocks of such a system? What have we learned about making opportunity and access widely available, and about what it means to build education systems that contributes to the reduction of social inequality and which prepare our young people civically, intellectually, morally to take on and solve the challenges of our time? And 4, underlying these questions is another core consideration for me, and that is, what is the link between education and society, right? Brown versus the Board of Education made a bet on this, that you could use education to create connections between young people that would heal the hatred and disconnection of prior generations, and that in doing so, you could steward a new generation that would move past racial division. Part of the impetus for Brown was that racial divides are actually not good for society. They weaken a nation state in the eyes of the world and internally. And to that end, desegregated schools did begin to serve that function, as well as to close achievement gaps in the 70s and early 80s. But as the policies began to shift, as we know, the social safety net weakened. And we saw regression and school segregation reemerge kind of in full force, and along with it, staggering increases in social and wealth inequality. And that history offers a caution for us all, as well as lessons. And I'm looking forward to digging into that conversation with my colleagues today. And finally, I'm going to leave you with this thought that I've been pondering. We can't build a future without learning from history, right? And we can't build a future without imagining something we've never seen. And so how do we hold both of those, both that learning from the history and being expansive in our imagination and our sense of possibility? So I'll stop there. Thank you.
And that, thank you so much, is a perfect segue to Carol Lee, who is president of the National Academy of Education, professor emerita in the School of Education and Social Policy and in African American Studies at Northwestern University. She is also a past president of the American Educational Research Association and past president of the National Conference on Research in Language and Literacy. She currently chairs the National Board of Education Sciences, which is a drama at this moment in and of itself, as the federal support for education research is being discontinued in many cases. Her work focuses on culturally responsive teaching and the learning sciences. She is co-editor of the Handbook of Cultural Foundations of Learning. And Carol, please take it away. I think you hold much of the answer to the question Naila left us with.
Okay, great. Well, thank you very much for inviting me to participate in this powerful series. Actually, before I go into the slides. So what I've argued for in the volume that's been produced is that we need what I call a dual thread, where we're both looking back at the lessons of African Americans in education in order to look forward, as Nyla has said. So the African American efforts to build robust learning environments for our children have always benefited all children. So, for example, James Anderson, in his book Education of Blacks from 1865 to 1935, documents how at the end of the Civil War, the first institutions that Black people formed were schools, independent schools that they founded, built the buildings, etc., paid for teachers, etc. And while they did that internal work, they simultaneously advocated with state governments and districts to invest financially in public education at a time when free public education was not freely available to poor whites in the South. And in fact, that our advocacy for civil rights have always benefited multiple communities. For example, the women getting the right to vote by 1920. And you can think about the role of African-American women, for example, in that struggle. So I'm calling for the need for what we have as both internal development as well as external activism. Internal development meaning there are 92,000 Black churches across the country. The activism of churches in local communities with young people, community organizations, creating mentoring programs, interest groups, etc. in our community. And at the same time, external activism, working on terms of school boards, how we vote, how we engage in public policy, etc. So what we can learn from Black education also from segregated schools under Jim Crow. So for example, you can look at the work of Vanessa Siddle Walker documenting the important relationships between families, communities, and schools in Black segregated schools during the Jim Crow South. Also think about the W. Du Bois, who did a graduation address in 1930 at Howard University, where he argued that the graduates needed to think not only about how their degrees could provide them with professional, development and access to capital, but equally important, that they had to become stewards in support of their communities. So, in thinking about the goals of education as being beyond simple technocratic ends of getting a job at some point, we at the National Academy of Education produced a report called Educating for Civic Reasoning and Discourse, in which we've argued that an essential role of education is to prepare young people to be able to engage in the civic dilemmas of our time, and that could not be more important than we're experiencing at this time. That report is available free online at the National Academy of Education website. In that report, we've argued that civic reasoning is not simply the purview of what kids learn in a civics class, but rather it involves knowledge and dispositions that need to be integrated in all classes. And we're in the process of producing reports for practitioners, giving illustrations of how you can teach civic reasoning and discourse in math, science, literacy, etc. We've argued that civic reasoning involves more than knowledge of history and governmental structure, which obviously it does, and it includes both conceptual and procedural knowledge related to topics that are addressed in a civic problem. So, for example, the recent COVID pandemic required lots of knowledge in science about viral mutations, lots of reports around, decisions that schools and districts should make that involve complex scientific knowledge, mathematical displays, etc. Civic reasoning also involves epistemology, that is, valuing complexity and resisting simplistic solutions to complex problems. That could not be more important in the environment that we're experiencing today. It clearly involves ethics that involve empathy for others, and a desire to help not only oneself but others, and dispositions to question, weigh multiple points of view, to value justice, to listen to others. We also are arguing that there are many findings from what's being called the science of learning and development that indicate clearly, particularly with lots of emerging science work in the field of neuroscience, of how thinking and emotions are deeply interdependent, that perceptions of the self, others, and task matter, and that the understanding that the ability to adapt through multiple pathways is endemic to what it means to be human, and that these fundamental propositions have to be incorporated in the design of any learning environments that are going to support robust learning and development. We also obviously need to address these problems, ecosystem support, to not simply what goes on in an individual classroom, but how we conceptualize and understand knowledge and learning in the academic areas, how we assess knowledge. There's a great deal of debates over how we assess and what we assess for, the breadth of what teachers need to know and the kinds of learning communities that need to be available to support teacher learning, and attention to broader ecological systems around healthcare, housing, safety, etc. Again, the development of robust learning environments for Black children and all children require a broad ecological system of supports and not simply what's in classrooms. So thank you.
I think bringing us down to sort of the foundations of the learning process and the development process is so important as we think about where we're going and how we get there. And I'm going to pass the ball now to Kent McGuire, who is the Program Director of Education at the William and Flora Hewlett Foundation. He leads the investment of the foundation's teaching and learning and open educational resources. Before joining Hewlett, he was president of the Southern Education Foundation. He was previously dean of the College of Education at Temple University. He held roles at the Manpower Development Research Corporation, Pew Charitable Trust, the Lilly Endowment. He served as Assistant Secretary of the U.S. Department of Education from 1998 to 2001 in the Clinton administration, and I'm sure is watching what is going on now with a great deal of insight. Kent, please take it away.
Thank you, Linda. A gracious introduction, just as Naila was saying, the only thing it confirms is that I'm nearly unemployable, can't keep a job. So I'm just gonna really pick up where Carol left off in a way, and say that, I have for quite a few years been working to help states and school districts think broadly, perhaps more broadly, about student learning and the role of schools in producing what at Hewlett we have for more than a decade called deeper learning outcomes. LPI has been a marvelous partner in both fleshing out that, as a practical matter, studying the different ways to get at it, and offering uh, a lot of advice, both in the context of how we prepare educators and in the context of how educators and policymakers sort of move toward this ambition. My chapter in the book is inspired by, quite frankly, a bit of frustration about the progress. It's not that we haven't made any, but we certainly haven't made enough. And that is especially true where Black children are concerned. I also spent a lot of time in the last couple of years peering into the data that is increasingly available from students themselves. I've funded a few surveys where we were intent on over sampling in urban context. Where what you hear, among other things, is fair bit of dissatisfaction with disengagement with schools, a lack of relevance and connection to the lives that young people lead, mental health issues on the rise. You could say we have had a pandemic there that predates COVID and was only exacerbated during the pandemic. And yet, this juxtaposed against a strong desire among young people to be able to work on things, work on issues that actually do matter in their lives. And so it got me to thinking harder, even harder about are there different frames for thinking about how we improve our schools and create better and more equitable learning outcomes for kids, particularly marginalized young people. And so as a person who grew up advocating, for a lot of these technical solutions, I began to go back and wonder about what could I possibly have been thinking of, back, in the early 2020s. So let me take a couple of seconds to explain how I came to this. I'll then say just two or three things about what I wish schools did a better job of, and try to be quick enough, Linda, that we can get to some broader conversation. First, it just struck me that for nearly a couple of decades, the education reform community, as it were, and this includes philanthropy, where I've lived, more than one or two lives, has been preoccupied with what I call or refer to as market-oriented ideas about school improvement and education reform. Even as an emerging science of learning has given us better ways of thinking about all this, even as that has occurred. So what am I talking about really quickly? One, let's just have schools compete with each other. The bad schools will close and the good ones will prosper. Two, let's have parents choose where they want their kids to go. Nothing wrong with that idea on the face of it, except that when you look at the evidence, it doesn't produce the kinds of outcomes we wish we could see. Maybe more fundamentally, and people might argue with me in the audience about this, let's focus the system on basic skills so we can just get kids ready for the workforce. And the theory of improvement that will sit in the background for this is something called test-based accountability. We'll find a relatively small set of things to measure that doesn't cost much to measure, And what the overlying assumption here is, that if we can just hold the system, the adults accountable for those outcomes, voila, those outcomes will emerge. Wish it were as easy as that. Main point I want to make here is that those ideas were neither inspired nor ambitious. And I think Brown's promise were for something much more inspired than that, which was that young people we can't really have a vibrant society or democracy if people don't learn how to live together. It's got to be some place where we all walk together, and that place, I will argue, is called school. Those are the public schools, and that the schools need to be more responsive to what our society and democracy really needs. And schools like that, in schools like that, young people would learn to do 2 or 3 things. One, and there's a lot more than this we can talk about when we get to Q&A, but the schools ought to do their part to convey common facts, or at least help kids learn to interrogate the facts that are before them, so that we can, they can make sense of what's going on in the world. 2, schools ought to develop the knowledge, durable skills, and dispositions for community and civic engagement. And that's what the survey data from young people tell us they want. Some genuine capacity to think critically about what's going on in their lives, so that they have the tools. Yes, they do need to know how a constitutional democracy works, necessary, but not sufficient. They need to know how to engage that world and change it in ways that make sense to them. And finally, schools need to concern themselves with and provide broader frame for thinking about social problems. I mean, this is, what we're hearing right now would have you think the schools are in the business of indoctrinating young people. I will argue that all that's going on here is a sincere interest in critical thinking and reasoning. More to the point, I think if we could embrace this higher democratic purpose, something more than work, and not that earning a living isn't ultimately really important, we're likely to unlock a couple of really important things. One, and I talk about this a little bit in the chapter, a much richer set of ideas about school reform and improvement, much broader way of thinking about schools in community and in relation to other institutions. And 2, likely to see much higher levels of engagement among students today, who are increasingly emotionally and mentally challenged and checking out at the thought that given the experience they have in school today. I think I'll stop there and wait to say more during Q&A.
All right, that is a tantalizing place to stop. And I want to thank you. I want to encourage us to dig a little deeper on the question of all of you have sort of mentioned or been connecting these ideas to the science of learning and development. What do we know about how kids actually learn? Kent was mentioning what kids want to see in their learning environment, what, is motivating. But I think when we were talking about this issue of Black education, we should maybe, before we get to the purposes and politics, say a little bit about the underpinnings, like what is it that really what lays the table for the cultural foundations of learning? What is it that we know about learning that should help us think about what public education becomes, what education for Black children becomes, that would be building on and drawing on the way children actually learn? And I want to let Naila and Carol both take first stabs at that, and then I'm going to come back to you, Kent, around the relationship to the purposes of education. Naila, you want to start us off?
Sure. Carol's my mentor, so I'm gonna start and jump in and make it right. So, I mean, we know a lot about the science of learning and development that is quite different than what we knew when we set schools up in this factory model, right? And one of the things that we have learned is that learning is not just an exercise of the mind. It's not just an intake of facts, right? Learning is a full, whole body, full emotional experience. And that emotional part, that part that's about, do you feel competent? Do you feel like you belong? Do you feel like others see you in the space as a person who has something valuable to add? Are you smart? Like that part of it is as integral to learning as your ability to compute facts or read text. And so attention to those kind of psychosocial aspects of learning is really, really important. We also know that learning is collective and social, so that we learn together. We learn from, the students learn from teachers, but they also learn from peers. And that kind of collective aspect to learning is really, really critically important to attend to, so that it's not an isolated, again, like purely individual activity. So maybe I'll pass to Carol to chime in.
Well, I would encourage folks to look at the work of Mary Helen Emmerdino Yang. You could go to YouTube and put in her name, and she has like a 7-minute video where she illustrates the neurological basis for the notion of learning being integrated in this way. She and Linda did an article together that Linda can give you access to about this. And what is essential in understanding is that prior work around learning presumed that learning occurred through neurological processes in the brain and with attention to a particular regions of the brain that dealt with cognition. But what neuroscientists have discovered is that the regions of the brain that focus emotions, cognition, perceptions, language, are always in dialogue with one another. They don't operate as isolated processes. And in fact, that the way the integrated system of how these different regions of the brain, emotions, cognition, language, perceptions, etc., are talking to one another, that integrated process is how our minds perceive that our bodies are experiencing fever or pain, to influence how we respond, are the same systems that operate when we are out in the world, in classrooms or any place else, to determine, is this someplace safe in which I should be engaged, or is this someplace that I should retreat because it's threatening to me, right? Are my perceptions of what I'm supposed to do have some relevance for me? If it doesn't, then why should I, invest in it at all? And so it's a fundamentally different way of thinking about learning, and also of learning as engaged, as we talked about in the civics report around civic knowledge, if you will, that knowledge involves not only facts, if you will, but concepts and processes and epistemologies. What the devil do I think I'm doing, right? So in the math world that Naila studies, if I think doing math is simply about following some procedure, some single procedure that the teacher taught me, there's a whole world that I can't engage in, and I don't even want to be engaged in because I don't have a procedure, you know what I mean, to deal with it. And so it requires a fundamentally different way of thinking about how we organize learning. We don't have any assessments to deal with these multiple dimensions. We don't have systems to support teachers and administrators and school systems, if you will. And what does it mean to think that relationships are going to matter, perceptions of relevance are going to matter? You know what I mean?
Mhm.
And and also a big idea coming out of the sort of science of learning development, neuroscience, is this whole field of epigenetics, where we have traditionally thought that genes determine what we do, and genes determine what you can do, right? And the whole notion of IQ, you know, et cetera, that ability is some static thing, when in fact, biologically, genes follow experience.
Mhm.
So that this notion of human beings as cultural beings, we know that babies from infancy pay more attention to human faces than objects. Why? Because relationships with other human beings are the levers for survival.
So just to follow that thread, and I'm gonna come back to you, Kent, around this next piece of, how do we, when we re-envision the purpose of schools, how do we take this into account? What you're saying is that, what schools are about is creating that set of experiences that then allow for that, kind of learning to occur. And clearly there are implications for what happens in the classroom. It needs to be safe, it needs to be trusting, it needs to be engaging and socially engaging and collaborative and so on. There are also implications for the way we think about the design of schools and the purpose of schools more generally. And so I want us to kind of look at both of these tracks about, what does that mean then for how we should be thinking about the design and purposes of schools. And Kent, you started to get into it, and then I think your 5 minutes might have been up and you
Yes,
just
yeah.
sort of stopped in midstream. So I want to give this back to you to sort of continue a little bit about how do we, take this kind of understanding and repurpose and redesign schools. And I invite Carol and Naila to come back into that
To jump
conversation
into that,
as
yeah.
well. Yeah.
Let me just start though with three really simple points about teaching. We've spent the last several years with a lot of noise talking about what teachers shouldn't do. And, when I wish we would just focus in pretty simple ways on what they should do, what we need them to do. And, it's as simple as, work on things that are important. Work on things that are true. Yeah, and then there's a big debate about ways of knowing, but it maybe focus on things that are age appropriate to sort of take some of the anxiety or risk, out of issues of culture and race and identity and the like. But to your point, Linda, to me, there are a whole series of things that we might focus on to encourage and support that kind of teaching and learning. And thinking about school organization and that design is a big part of that. I think we're at a point, where we really need to imagine something called the school day and year. We need to think differently about how we use time. One of the core resources, in schools, not just teacher time, but even the student time. Um, there are lots of ideas. We've been a big supporter at Hewlett of project-based learning and other kinds of experiences, some of which happen in schools, some might not. And so we probably need an education system that is in various ways more connected and more permeable to other kinds of community-based and youth-serving organizations, to include different kinds of relationships to the world of work. I'm thinking about apprenticeships and internships and things of that sort, as well as maybe new and revised ways of thinking about what it means to be college ready, different kinds of connections and pathways into post-secondary experiences. All of this requires a level of investment in our system, that, long ago we had, but which has waned. Teachers are going to need support. So we have to have resources for professional learning. And so, I mean, there was a time when if we didn't exclude the kids, if we cared about how well educators were prepared, and we took care to make sure that our schools were more equally resourced, we actually saw the learning gaps between kids of color, Black kids, and white kids come down. It's sort of startling to observe that during the same period I described a few minutes ago, with these market-driven ideas about improvement, that we actually saw learning gains start to widen out again.
Yeah.
Yeah. Go ahead, Nayla.
Well, I see Carol want to get into it. I'll try to make it brief. So there's so many threads. There's a thread happening in the chat that I think is directly relevant here. That's about two things about the fact that Black students are often described as not proficient in math, reading, and so on. And we start from that place of a lack of proficiency in the types of structures and ways of teaching and learning that we set up for young people. So we start from a deficit perspective and then try to remediate, right? And so we're here talking about the legacy of Brown and Black education. And one of the things that we lost with desegregated schools, one of the things we had in the segregated South in schools was Black teachers who loved Black children. Not all of them, all the things, all the variation. But Vanessa Siddle Walker's work has done a really beautiful job in documenting what it looked like in the segregated South for Black teachers to be connected to young people, to be connected to families, and to seek what the title of her first book, the highest potential of those young people. So that's a place I think we can look to history for some of the practices, some of the structures, some of the strategies, what it looks like when you have a school system that is set up and teaching practices that are set up to really believe in and build on the potential of all young people. What we didn't have was the equity of resources, and it was one of the things that we thought Brown would provide. And as it turns out, it's true and not true that there were more equal resources provided.
Yeah, yeah. Well, in the chat also, just to call out, because some really good insights, the questions about how do you create those environments that have more emphasis on drawing in parents, and there's questions about how do we do that effectively, less emphasis on bringing in police, which then, reinforce the punitive, environment and the threat in the environment for Black students, and then how we build the environments for whole child education are all part of the discourse that's going on here. So I want us to lean in on that and talk a little bit about that. And then we're going to deal in the last few minutes with the politics that we're in right now. So Carol, punting the ball to you.
So one of the first point is that the propositions that we're putting forward are not only applicable to Black children, but they're applicable to all children. Second, that consistent with the work of Vanessa Siddle Walker about Black schools under Jim Crow South, one was the strong connection between families, communities, and schools. Teachers lived in the same community as their children, right? And they understood their roles as not merely technocratic conveyors of knowledge, but as professionals who supported families in developing whole, strong, resilient young people. So that's the first point I want to make. Second is, and also Leslie from the Howard, former dean, help me.
Leslie Fenwick.
Leslie Fenwick has talked about research showing that all children, Black, white, or other, do better academically when taught by Black teachers. And I think it's not about the melanin in their skin. It's about the perception of what their roles are. It's important. One of the things that we don't do in our data, for example, NAEP data, is disaggregate by poverty level, right? We pay attention to this disaggregation by race, but not poverty within, racial groups. We also should look at, in terms of international data, Tim's, Pearl's, PISA. PISA is the international given to 15-year-olds every 4 years. They do what they call a social disparities report, in which they document countries around the world in which poverty and immigrant status do not predict outcomes, where poor children, immigrant children, ethnic minority children score in the top quartile. But we don't pay any attention to what those features are. And Linda, you talked about that years ago in the flat world and education. And finally, that we do not perceive teaching as an intellective profession. So when, I'm from Northwestern University, Northwestern Hospital is one of the best in the country. And they did this double transplant. I don't remember quite all what it was. But when surgeons, for example, are wrestling with a very complex medical problem, there's not a single surgeon that sits down and says, I got the solution to this problem, and it's in some book, and I can point out some little script, and if I do this, everything will work right. All areas that involve complex problem solving, of which teaching is clearly that, just as is parenting, involves ongoing, lifelong, collective study, learning how to be, having systemic knowledge, but learning how to use that systemic knowledge in response to what the learners in this case present. And so whatever we're thinking about on the policy level and an investment level, I think has at the end of the day got to be focused on how do we prepare teachers and support teachers, not as recipients of something, but as problem solvers. And we organized the school day to accommodate that. We could look at China, Finland, Singapore, all around the world, of countries that outscore us. They outscore middle-class white children on these international assessments because the organization of schooling and the preparation is diametrically opposed to what we do here.
And just to build on that, the sort of preparation of teachers and administrators for schools that are building on what we know about learning in all the ways that we've talked about, but that also are relationally designed, that are designed for positive, constructive relationships, which the factory model did not, take into account at all. And whether that means teaching teams in secondary schools that share students and advisory systems or whatever the elements, we know that when relational practices like social and emotional learning and restorative practices are increased in a school, you see increases in achievement, especially for Black students, but also in mental health, and in belongingness and in connection. So there's a big agenda, and then there's a policy agenda. You've all mentioned curriculum and assessment. If you're in a system that is saying march through the standards in order, get through the pacing guide, and then take the multiple choice test, are you doing the things is it easy to do the things that we are talking about here in that system? And be sure that there are punitive labels attached to kids in schools associated with that regimen. So we've got a big think to do, and we also have to be thinking about what policies and practices will allow us to preserve equity, deal with the current attacks that are coming for diversity, equity, and inclusion in this next 4 years. So many of the questions coming in the chat are, what can we do to navigate educational equity issues, as well as these issues that are rooted in the foundations of learning over these coming years?
So if I
We'll
could
give each
just,
of you a shot at that.
so if
Go
I
ahead,
could
Carol.
just intercede what I hope may be a link to the question you've had around the questions of focuses of public education in particular.
Mhm.
The public narrative that is most prominent today, but it's been a long-standing one, is that attention to issues of culture and identity are about sort of a left-wing, let's do something for colored kids thing. It's not presumed to say that we live in a complex democratic experiment whose system of governance was designed to both be elastic enough to accommodate difference. You can be racist, homophobic, you can be whatever you want to be in your own little individual life, right? But you can't hurt others in the process. And so figuring out how do we, and at the same time creating a system of governance that allows people to, you know what I mean, to navigate all this complexity, right? And in order to deal with this and this complete greater interdependence we have in, in the world right now, requires citizens who really can navigate complexity, who can understand, diversity of points of view, differences, etc. And public education, as Amy Gutman argues, is the only place where you can prepare children to deal with that complexity, right? And you can have, there's, the boundaries become, you can have whatever interpretation of the Holocaust in Europe you want, but you can't deny that it happened. Do you know what I mean? So just what does it mean to prepare young people as holistically to deal with that? And the things we're talking about in terms of the organization of schooling will prepare kids to deal with that complexity.
Two
Thank you, Carol.
thoughts, Linda, on the politics. One is, I mean, I see in the chat a question about superintendents and education leaders more broadly. I'd say that there's a good deal more research going on in the moment about the implications of these dark politics on school boards and school leaders. One of the things that has emerged, Carl Combs, we're funding a lot of meetings he's doing with superintendents, is that they need to be more attuned to building coalitions and constituencies in their own backyard. That just focusing on instruction, necessary but not sufficient to sort of building durable coalitions that can fend off some of the stuff that's happening locally. The other, I think, thing to remember, as I am peering into a lot of public opinion data, we're inclined to think that somehow there is a mandate out there to do what current actors in the government suggest. The public opinion data would suggest that's not at all true. And then what we're talking about here, back to Carol's point about what's good for Black kids is good for everybody. Turns out there's a large, if silent, majority of parents who agree with Carol, and they actually want an accurate history. Yes, they want their schools to be safe too. There's lots of things they want, but they want more money invested in the public schools. They want more support for their teachers. So I think starting there is a good way to think harder about the political strategies that we might embrace, both to slow things down that we don't want to see happen and to speed things up, the kinds of improvements we actually want to see.
Yeah, I agree with everything my colleagues have said, and I'm just thinking about that the policy environment that we are in the midst of isn't just kind of anti-children. It is anti-children, but it is anti-human. I mean, when you look at what's happening with the immigration, the approach to immigration, the deportations, the mass firing of federal employees, the like from start to finish, the whole thing is an exercise in dehumanization and not valuing whole people or creating holistic environments. So when I think about, well, what can we do? It strikes me that the first thing that comes to my heart to say is we have to try to figure out how we stay whole and well in this space that is attacking our deepest values and our very humanity. And then how do we come together to buffer for young people in our school communities, how to keep them whole and well in the midst of this politics that we are navigating. And of course, there are all the things about being civically engaged, writing your congressperson, like all of that, figuring out how you filter, and so much it depends on what your particular context is and how that's being filtered for you by your state, by your district, by these other political actors. So there are many things we can do. And for me, at the heart of it is like, we gotta, we also need to figure out how to stay whole in this moment.
So I would add on two comments. One is I think that the action is at the local level, and that communities, whether it's parent councils and individual schools, communities in advocacy work with, the school district leadership, with state leadership. I think that's where the action is going to come. Not saying that we don't need to do the advocacy at the federal level, but it's the people who, at the end of the day, you know what I mean, who vote. Politicians are responsive to feeling that they're not going to get reelected, right? And it's on the ground where that takes place. And I think that's the place where we can find the most power, working not just as individuals, but in collectives, in which the creating environments for our collective well-being, you know what I mean, and there is important. And finally, I would say, in terms of people of African descent, you all know that Wall Street was an African burial ground in the 1800s. Schomburg Center worked to get it acknowledged as a sacred space. They worked with archaeologists from Howard University, dug up remains, clear evidence people were in poor health. But what they hadn't anticipated is people were buried with amulets on the body, markings, and in positions that said, "I'm Yoruba. I'm not a slave. I'm Igbo." You might have thought that, I didn't. And so the argument, I think, from that for people of African descent is that what our people knew, the relationships they established, the belief systems that they focused on, sustained generations. We think this is hard. Imagine being an enslaved person on a plantation, you know what I mean? You birth a baby, and when that baby's 5 or 6 years old, somebody thinks they own you, takes them and leave, sends them off. Asa Hilliard had documented how at the end of the Civil War, you had Black people physically walking across the South to find, where's my mother? Where's my brother? Where's my child? And so that's another important source for us as people of African descent, is this fundamental belief in, the concept of ma'at, that there's divinity within each of us, and other people can believe what they want to believe, but they're never going to get inside my head. That's what I got is from my mother. She said, no, you can't.
We're going to need another webinar, Linda.
We are, because we have now run out of time, but I'm going to quote one of our members of the audience who says, in the end, it's about how we keep our revolutionary mindset and embrace evolutionary practices to move this transformative work forward. And I want to thank this brilliant group of panelists. Thank everyone who joined us today. Here is the information about how you can access the prior webinars and the resources that came with us. And let's make the road by walking it. Thank you.